Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to Michelle and Fatia for setting the stage and doing all the technical stuff that I could never wrap my head around. So I was asked to present today on the NGO perspective around CITES and just what we feel about it as an organisation who attended and was involved in some of the background processes. So fortunately, you all know what CITES is now. It's a big international trade convention, and its key aim is to ensure that wildlife trade is done sustainably without threatening the survival of species in the wild. And the COP happens every 3 years. The last one is in Johannesburg. So fortunately, Tia and Michelle have done all of this for you. And from our perspective, we think COP was wildly successful. It was certainly the biggest COP ever. It was very well attended. It was very open to the public, which when I attended the one in Bangkok, it really wasn't that open. You know, you couldn't get into all the sessions. Things were quite closed. And in good South African spirit, there was a lot of public participation. The press could attend session. And it was really a very open, inclusive kind of meeting. Our South African delegation was exceptionally well prepared. You couldn't fault anything they did. The work that Michelle did behind the scenes with getting everything with proper scientific basis done, proposals were fantastic. You really can't fault the way our government prepared for this COP, and I think we can be very, very proud of what they've done. Our non-detriment finding assessments were all in place. We've got decision-making trees around non-detriment findings, and I can promise you there isn't one other country in Africa that could do it the way South Africa has done it. So our government did very, very well. We've already seen all the highlights for the South African species. The Cape Mountain zebra's downlisting was a big highlight and real feather in the cap for the conservation work that's been done, both by our government and by the private sector. The wild ginger being listed on Appendix 2 helps South Africa regulate the trade more effectively. And of course the pangolins, all species being uplisted from Appendix 2 to Appendix 1 as one of the most traded species in the world was a highlight. But it's not only decisions that gather attention at these meetings, there's also sometimes the rejections. So all the rejections around international trade in ivory really got some of the pro-traders quite hot under the collars. Lions not being uplisted onto Appendix 1 got some of the animal rights system welfareists hot under the collar. So there was quite a lot of discussion on also what didn't actually happen. But I'm going to just have a quick chat around lions as a case study because carnivores are what I work on, it's what I'm more familiar with. So while lions didn't get uplisted to Appendix 1, they all remained on Appendix 2, which makes perfect sense because in Southern Africa, our lions do not qualify for an Appendix 1 listing. But there was this annotation that speaks around the trade in bones. So there was, the annotation said, as Tia so nicely laid out for us, that there's a 0 annual quota for commercial trade in bones from wild lions, which is amazing if you're a wild lion. And that's probably a really key conservation intervention for wild lions in Africa to make a huge difference to lion conservation. But then there was also part of annotation that spoke about setting a quota for the trade in captive bred lion bones from South Africa. So while we're talking about lion bones, we're inclined to throw these things around thinking that everyone spends their days thinking about it, and not everyone always does. Well, traditionally, tiger bone has been used in Chinese traditional medicine in a wellness type of tonic. But in 1993, the Chinese government banned trade in tiger bone, which then led to the captive breeding of tigers to supply this bone market. But studies showed that this was problematic because it really did start to fuel demand and increase poaching of wild tigers. Then Traffic did a survey on some Chinese traditional medicine markets, and they started to find that wine had been packaged to resemble tiger bone wine, but it was labeled as containing Panthera leo, so it was found that lion bone is starting to become a substitute for tiger bone. And South Africa has been trading in lion bone. It's seen as a sustainable byproduct of our canned or captive hunting industry. So it is seen to be sustainable, and this trade has been happening. So this isn't a decision that's been made that we're now going to start trading. It has been happening anyway. However, from the EWT's perspective, we're very concerned about this for several reasons. First of all, the process that was followed. We don't feel there was any real public participation around this annotation that was put out there. There was a lot of public participation around all the CITES motions that were put together, and we never really saw this one coming in any of the public participatory processes. We don't feel this was based on any published scientifically defendable data, whereas everything else we do is amazing and it's totally defendable. And we feel there's absolutely no conservation benefits to this at all. And even in our lion biodiversity management plan, it's recognised that captive bred lions have no conservation benefits. It's also been shown that the captive breeding of tigers has threatened wild tigers, and these tigers are bred for their bones. So now why are we promoting breeding of lions for their bones? Will this not also have a negative impact on on wild lions. And I don't believe that we're learning from past experiences on tigers. The tiger people have come a very long way in this process, from where they were harvesting bones from wild tigers to captive breeding to supply, and are finally shutting off the captive breeding of tigers for supplying of their bones. And in fact, at the self-same COP, a decision was taken to try and stop breeding captive breeding tigers for their bones, because it's just been such a mess. But yet at the same COP, we make a decision that relates to lions, so it just feels like there's a little bit of a lack of alignment for different species. There's also concern that lion bone trade could stimulate an increase for demand in lion bones generally. Also, often wild specimens are seen to be more powerful in medicinal circles than captive bred specimens. So perhaps there could be more demand for the wild lion populations. And it also may, in a roundabout way, perpetuate demand for tiger products, because lion bone is only a substitute for tiger. It's not actually what the medicinal property is looking for, which again could have consequences for wild populations. So to sum it up, the key concerns around this annotation are it enshrines captive breeding for parts, despite the known threats that may possibly exist. We don't even know. I mean, Tia spoke about CITES saying that, yes, we're going to do this, but we also require a study because we don't really have the information on what's going on. It doesn't prevent any other party starting captive breeding of lions to supply bones. It doesn't require the quota to be approved by the Secretariat. We can just set it, and they're captive lions and they breed like crazy. So it's unlikely that we can unsustainably utilize these bones from captive animals. It doesn't apply the precautionary principle, particularly for a species that in much of its range is declining. I mean, lions in West Africa are really in trouble. And it totally ignores the IUCN motion that was passed only 2 weeks earlier in Hawaii, where it was voted with vast majority that we should probably look at stopping captive breeding of lions, both for trophy hunting and for their parts. So from the conservation perspective, we think this captive issue, I mean, we know that captive carnivores are highly problematic across the board. Cheetahs, lions, the whole works. Wherever you've got carnivores in captivity in South Africa right now, we do have conservation problems. We're providing more incentives for breeding animals in cages than we are for conserving them. How does this proposal give any kind of incentive for conserving wild lions? It doesn't. It incentivizes to put them in cages and breed them. What are the implications for other species? We have no idea. Could there be implications for wild leopard, whose bones could get onto the market too? We can't ID wild and captive bones in the market. We can't ID the difference in lion bones, tiger bones, leopard bones when they come through customs. And we're already starting to see an increase in captive lion poaching. There's been about 3 or 4 cases this year where captive bred lions have been poached and their body parts taken. Granted, we don't know what they're taken for. It seems to be medicinal. We don't know if the trade is national or international, but nonetheless, these captive bred lions are being poached. And our South African Predator Breeders Association states that they're keeping the prices of these products low so they can meet the demands, yet we're still seeing poaching happening. So to conclude just around the lion bone issue, I think most NGOs, at least in our sort of sector, are very concerned about this annotation. We're very worried there could be unintended negative consequences for lion conservation. We're very worried about the welfare of captive lions. These lions could be just kept until they're a year and a half old and slaughtered for their bones, and the welfare issues are huge. And there's this huge gap in our legislation around who's responsible for the welfare of these lions. DEA issue the permits, but DEA are not mandated to look after the welfare of the species. That falls under the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. And sort of for now, the welfare has kind of been juggled between the two, and it really is quite problematic. We're quite concerned about the process that was followed making that decision. And on a more sort of bigger picture, we're quite concerned about damage to brand South Africa. We've seen the damage that the Blood Lions documentary has done to our captive industry in South Africa. And I think South Africa, one of our key tourism incomes is through our ecotourism, and we can't afford any damage to that. We want to look like the shining light of conservation, and we are a shining light in conservation, but this lion issue is really putting a bit of a blight onto that. So I'm standing up here telling you what we as EWT think, and does it really matter? I mean, CITES is a government a government trade convention. So what do NGOs do in all of this? Do we just stand here on the side and shake our flag and get angry with government because it didn't go our way? Or do we have a constructive role to play? And I think a couple of things need to be considered first. When you talk about NGO, there's a wide range of NGOs with varying mandates. So the South African Predator Breeders Association is an NGO. A lot of the hunting organisations are NGOs. The Endangered Wildlife Trust, Wildlands, the IUCN, I4, the Animal Rights System, Welfareists. So the NGO spectrum is massive, and we've all got differing mandates, and there's very, very different objectives inside the NGO sector. If you're following the press during CITES, there was lots of shouting and screaming about these Western NGOs trying to tell Africa how to manage its wildlife. Well, a lot of us are actually NGOs that are based in the country, that employ citizens of those countries, that care about the conservation and biodiversity of those countries. So we're not all white Western NGOs. Some of us actually do live in the countries, work there, and are citizens of those countries. And also, for many of the NGOs, particularly in the conservation sector, we're not financially incentivized to be there. For us, it actually costs us a lot of money to go to some of these things, and we're not gaining any money out of any of these processes. We don't own animals, we don't trade in animals, we don't own any land, so we've got no real financial incentive to be doing this. And in some of the important roles we do play, we raise awareness, we inform the public, activism lobbying at various levels, not just shaking flags and banners, but doing it in roundtable meetings with governments and other NGOs, and acting as watchdogs generally for the processes and how they're done. I feel also NGOs, we're quite privileged in many ways because we can employ experts who can spend their entire day thinking about one issue or two issues or a group of species. And that's a really privileged position to be in. So we spend all our time, I spend all my time thinking about carnivores. And the people in government can't. Michelle's got cycads and carnivores and perlemoen and wild ginger and all of that. So I'm really privileged that I can spend all my time thinking about carnivores. We run projects in the field that monitor these animals, that reintroduce them, that work one-on-one with trade issues. We can provide data to these processes. And we can also provide, and often do, external support for government delegations at these meetings. Some of the key roles we can play is we can, particularly around the non-detriment finding processes, we can lobby for NDFs on certain species, we can actively participate in NDF assessments, we've often run workshops around those assessments, we've helped write up reports on them, we provide lots of data for all these NDFs across the board, and also helping in developing norms and standards for trophy hunting and setting quotas and those kinds of things. So we do have a lot to contribute, but also in terms of our scientific knowledge and knowledge of the species on the ground. So just to conclude, I think NGOs do and will continue to play a very important role in this whole CITES, this big hairy beast that is CITES. South Africa put on an amazingly good show at COP in Johannesburg. It was the biggest ever, the agenda was smooth, we ran a day early, which got me to go to the Lion Park with some ICN delegates, where I left a piece of my soul behind. There's legacy projects going forward, so CITES wasn't something that just happened in Joburg and closed. There's continuation and leaving a legacy behind as a result of CITES. I feel at the next COP there's massive room for NGOs to collaborate for better conservation outcome. There are platforms we can use to collaborate effectively with governments, and I think that will ensure that we've got a more transparent and sustainable use of our natural resources in the long term. Thank you.